a large crowd followed Jesus because they saw the signs, meaning the miracles that he was performing. And as we read this gospel from the perspective of Christ's Paschal mystery, we understand now what is happening, because the Jewish feast of Passover was near, passing from death to life, from the slavery to freedom. Jesus Christ will make the sign of bread that was the integral part of the Jewish Passover feast, his body, the bread that the Jews use to celebrate the Jewish Passover feast. Jesus will incorporate into the first Eucharist, saying it's no longer now the symbol of passing from the slavery of Egypt to the freedom, but now this is my body. I kill sin in me, take the sins of others upon me, and deliver the new freedom that is demonstrated in the chalice. That's no longer wine, but his blood. But when many people, and we find out there are 5,000 men, a huge throng of followers were pursuing him into the wilderness, he shows another dimension of this feast of the Passover, which is he feeds the hungry hearts, even though it has to do with the physical bread. But when everybody was following him, so taken by his words that they forgot about the food. Because now, where can we buy enough food for all these people? And so he said this to Philip to test him, because Jesus already knew what he was going to do. So why did he ask? On one hand, to make Philip reflect. What do you think? Is my hand too short to provide a miracle, as my hand was not short to deliver the people from the slavery of Egypt? What do you think is the solution to a group of people starving in the wilderness? How can we go about it? And as we usually do, so did Philip, applied his human reasoning. 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. Saying, look, no way we can feed them. It's impossible. They will pass out. There is no, humanly speaking, we can feed all this huge group of people with what we have. That's our thinking. That's human thinking. Sometimes I think Philip could have been a little smarter, saying to Jesus, I have no idea. You know it. They are following you. That could have been more kind of intelligent on his part. Instead, he tries to apply his own resources, his own way of thinking. And many times, Jesus puts us to the test to ask ourselves, what are we going to do at this stage? I would say even similarly to how Prophet Ezekiel was taken into a huge valley filled with bones, and the angel asked Ezekiel, will these bones come back to life? And that was a smart answer. You know it, O Lord. Instead of saying, no way. It's all lost. Well, Philip was not as smart as Ezekiel, let's put like this, in a kind of anecdotal way. But now, what is an important detail is a nameless boy We didn't even know where he came from. We only find out he had food. Others, either they kept the food secretly hidden, or they have eaten the food, or just they pursued Jesus without thinking about the food. Regardless, we find out that there is this boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Didn't want to hide. Didn't want to keep the food for himself. I'm moved by this passage that Pope Francis liked to comment on, showing that on one hand, Jesus did not materialize food just out of nothing. He could, but he didn't want to do that. He used what was in possession of this boy who was willing to give what he has to Jesus. Thinking about a person who is insignificant, small, little, unknown. That's exactly the history of the many apostles, many prophets, many great figures in the history of Israel, that God chooses those who are nothing, insignificant, nameless, not even a point of asking them for help, but a generosity of this little kid brought about a huge miracle that no one would have ever expected. That's what Saint Mother Teresa and other saints taught and displayed. Little that you have, your gifts, your talents, your resources, given to Jesus with a generous heart, will provide not only for you, but for many other people around you. Because when we keep our resources for ourselves, not only they can bring a downfall for us in terms of our own selfish, self-centered needs being met, but at this stage, we find out they are meant to be to feed others. And that's the huge thing that takes place right here. The little that we can place in Jesus' hands, the little that we are, as poor as we might be, as we see number of saints, for example, health-wise, were very fragile. Intellectually, not matching great professors from famous universities. No connections, no noble birth, as St. Paul would say. God chose nothing to confound those who consider themselves to be someone. That's the greatness of the working of God. But again, this boy was generous, saying, here it is. I place everything I own in your hands. I give it to you. That's a generosity of heart. That's something that the devil will work hard to make us so preoccupied about our lives and about our own future and what we are and who we are, that further on our hearts will get shut, will be very self-centered, will not see others and their needs. That's completely contrary to what we find out. In Jesus' hands, a huge miracle takes place. The Messianic miracle, the Passover miracle, meaning now he is passing the people from the hunger, which, as I mentioned before, does not only link to physical but spiritual hunger, to satisfaction in overabundance. At the end, Jesus would say, gather the fragments left over so that nothing will be wasted. So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. Why didn't Jesus say, look, I can perform another miracle whenever I want and however I want. Just forget about those little scraps that actually fell in between different shrubs and bushes and grass. As we find out, there was a lot of them. He could have. And yet, there is spiritual meaning in this passage as well. As if to say, I'm extremely generous with you, but don't be wasteful with my graces. St. Paul would say, do not receive the grace of God in vain. I pondered on this phrase for a long time, because we can receive God's graces in a very non-intelligible, in a superficial way. The graces are flowing. We don't stop to reflect. We don't ponder. We don't even ask ourselves what He wants to tell us through those gifts that He's providing. Right here, a danger is, great, we got our stomachs filled up. Now let's move on. Nope. Wait. Everything that I provided for you is valuable, even the smallest of the things that you may think are of no importance. Everything is critical. Everything is important. So when they started picking the little things, those little actually provided this huge amount of 12 wicker baskets with those fragments. That has been interpreted as a sign of evangelization. Now watch. Further on, Jesus will be met by the Canaanite woman, who would be crying out and shouting after him and the apostles. And Jesus treated them, we may say, in a very distant and dismissive way, until she said, look, even the small dogs that are sitting under the table of their masters can be fed with the scraps that fall down from the master's table. Because earlier on, Jesus said it's not good to take the food, the bread, from the sons and give it to the dogs, calling her a dog. As St. Augustine says, that was very offensive. But if you link that passage with what we just heard, sure enough, you can be filled. You ate to overabundance. You're aware what you have received. Now, anybody who wants, you can pass it on. You can give it on. You start realizing that everything you have received is not only for your own personal satisfaction, but to be passed on. That is so vital when we speak about evangelization, passing on the message. We need to be filled up. And Jesus provides it. And He does it perfectly. But now you can give to it to others. What you don't even need because you have been filled up. You are able to be as generous as this little kid. And as God has been generous with you, you are generous with others. As I explained before, a sign of a holy person is generosity on different levels. Material, personal, in terms of one's own time, one's own resources, one's own ability to share the experience of God. Let us ask that, filled with the eternal bread from this altar, being filled and satisfied, we can also give it to those who are around us, those who are in need.